Welcome to the second half of my attempt at determining the best and worst roller coaster from every manufacturer who has coasters I've ridden. In my last video I made my way through the first 11 manufacturers on the list, and here's my ranking of the rest. Let's get started. Let's begin with the company that has arguably a better flat ride lineup than a coaster lineup, Zamperla. Unfortunately, this is another company I've only ridden smaller family scale coasters from. Even so, I've definitely ridden enough variety in their rides to put them on this list. The best coaster I've ridden from Zamperla as of this point is Wild West Express at Adventure Park USA. This is a great family thrill coaster that has some fun elements and transitions. Unfortunately, it's definitely not the smoothest ride, but the intense G's it pulls during some of the helixes does make up for this. Now, the worst coaster I've ridden by Zamperla isn't too much of a surprise, as it's considered one of the worst coaster models of all time. Time Warp at Canada's Wonderland, a Zamperla Volair model. Chances are you've already heard a lot about this horrendous model, so there's not much I have to add. If you haven't, these Volair models are weirdly designed and jerky compact flying coasters. Combined with some of the most uncomfortable restraints I've experienced, Time Warp is one of the worst coasters I've ridden and the worst I've ridden from Zamperla. Din Corporation is a wooden coaster manufacturer that built a handful of roller coasters across the United States in the late 1980s and early 90s. Unfortunately, only a few of the coasters are still operating, and I've ridden 3 of them. The best coaster I've ridden built by Din is one of the most legendary wooden coasters on the planet, the Beast at Kings Island. This is just an absolutely massive ride, winding its way through the woods surrounding Kings Island. I'm a big fan of this ride, but will admit that it unfortunately doesn't do much outside of the great helixes and the fun of speeding through the woods. Unfortunately, the majority of Din's coasters aren't as great, and Predator at Darien Lake is definitely the worst in my opinion. Unfortunately, I may be a bit biased against this ride more than others, because the only ride I got on it was in the pouring rain during an already not so great visit to Darien Lake. Even so, Predator is a roller coaster that just more or less meanders around its layout, without delivering any airtime or any major enjoyment for its riders. E&F Myler Industries primarily makes family and kiddie coasters, and have built a large number of the operating kiddie coasters across America. I've ridden a handful of these kiddie coasters, and even though most of them are pretty similar, there's enough variation models and ride experience to determine a ranking. For my best, I'm going with Cosmos Curves at Knoebels. This is a surprisingly highly lauded kiddie coaster, mainly for its unique interaction with the park's boat ride, as well as its surprising amount of airtime for a coaster of its scale. For my worst from E&F Myler, I'm picking Wilderness Run at Carowinds. This is the same classic single-circuit kiddie coaster that's at a large number of parks. Because of this, it's not a bad kiddie coaster by any means, but just the weakest I've ridden from this manufacturer. Zero is a German ride manufacturer that has built close to 200 roller coasters around the world, most of which have been smaller family coasters, although they have a decent selection of higher thrill coasters in their lineup. I've unfortunately only ridden 3 of Zero's roller coasters, but my personal best is Verbolten at Busch Gardens Williamsburg. This ride is of that special breed of roller coasters that is simultaneously great thrill coasters as well as great rides for the entire family. The indoor section is great, and the launch sections up to the final drop over the river make for a very fun ride. One of Zero's most popular models is the family Tivoli model, and one of those, Harley Quinn Crazy Train at Six Flags Great Adventure, is my personal least favorite from Zero. This is a standard family coaster, with the only really notable aspect being that it's an incredibly long train. As I said with some other worst entries on this list, this isn't a bad ride, it just happens to be the worst from this manufacturer that I've ridden, so therefore I more or less have to choose it as the worst from that manufacturer. Pinfari is probably one of the least liked manufacturers who has been a major player in the roller coaster industry. This is mainly because they honestly don't make that many good or even notable coasters. Because of this, there isn't a big gap in quality between my best and worst from them. For my personal best from Pinfari, I'm going with Rolly's coaster at Morey's Piers. This is the incredibly common Z40 model, and it's pretty much a standard family coaster, mainly just delivering a slow-paced ride, giving some smaller time on a few of the drops. Despite this, Rolly's is pretty well maintained by the park, so it does give a relatively smooth ride. On the other hand, is a ride that is nowhere near as smooth or comfortable. The now defunct Python at Playland's Castaway Cove. This is the very common ZL42 looping coaster model, which follows the figure 8 layout with a small vertical loop early in the ride. Unfortunately, I got a very rough and uncomfortable experience on Python, so that places it pretty definitively as one of the worst coasters I've ever ridden. On the bright side, this was removed a couple years back and replaced with the much better Gale Force, which I have yet to ride, but it does look pretty interesting. Morgan Rides and Manufacturing is one of those companies that almost exclusively makes a single ride model. In this case, it's the Hyper model, of which 7 have been built around the world. Unfortunately, I've only ridden 2 rides from Morgan, and both of them are pretty solid rides in my opinion. The best I've ridden from Morgan is Phantom's Revenge at Kennywood. This was originally an Aerodynamics Mega Looping Coaster, until Morgan was brought in during the 2000 off-season to completely redo the ride as a terrain-based hypercoaster. This is one of the best operating roller coasters in the United States, delivering incredible ejector airtime, even if the ride duration is unfortunately somewhat short. Because of this, Steel Force at Dorney Park is my worst Morgan coaster by default. This ride delivers somewhat decent airtime throughout the ride, the best of which comes during the small ejector hills during the second half of the experience. However, the large airtime hills early in the ride and the big Helix turnaround don't really provide any significant forces, which does make it a somewhat boring ride in some aspects of the experience. Marlboro Rides is one of the less popular roller coaster manufacturers, but they have a somewhat diverse ride collection around the world. The most popular coaster model is a lineup of spinning coaster models, multiple of which I have ridden. However, none of these spinning coasters are my best or worst from Marlboro. My personal best from this manufacturer is Hollywood Rip Ride Rocket at Universal Studios Florida. This is probably one of the most iconic roller coasters in Florida, although it honestly only provides a somewhat decent ride. The stats aren't too bad, and the steep drop and non-inverting loop are fun, but the 4 mid-course brake fronts pretty much kill all momentum and lead to pretty terrible pacing. I'm going with Wild Mouse at Dorney Park as my worst from Marlboro. There's not much to say about this coaster, since it's just a standard Wild Mouse layout and doesn't do anything unique that sets it apart at all. Schwarzkopf Industries is one of the most famous roller coaster manufacturers, due to their record-setting creations and the first of their kind models during the 1970s and 80s. Unfortunately, I've only ridden a couple of Schwarzkopf's roller coasters, so I can't speak to the quality of them as a whole, but the ones I've ridden are fairly enjoyable. My best from Schwarzkopf is from my home park, and it is probably one of my most ridden roller coasters, Super Duper Looper at Hershey Park. This is one of the first modern inverting coasters, and it still holds up pretty well for its age. While it's nowhere near as intense as the other great coasters next to it, Super Duper Looper is still fun, and serves to be a great introduction for younger riders to inversions. My worst from Schwarzkopf is one of the company's most iconic cloned models, Wildcat at Adventure Park USA. This is a great family coaster, although the slow speeds and the fact it's definitely more family oriented places it low on my list. Premier Rides is a relatively new company to the attractions industry, and they've made a name for themselves by making almost exclusively high-quality launch coasters. My best from Premier is Joker's Jinx at Six Flags America. This model is probably most well known for the Flight of Fear coasters at King's Dominion and King's Island, but I'm going with one of the outdoor versions instead. I mainly made this decision because being outside lets the near-miss elements of the spaghetti bowl design be more impactful and add more thrill to the ride experience. For my worst from Premier Rides, I'm going with another popular clone design, but although it might be a controversial pick, I'm picking Tempesto at Busch Gardens Williamsburg. Premier's Skyrocket 2 model has become popular at parks around the world over the last decade, but Tempesto is currently the only one I've ridden. The main reason I'm giving Tempesto such a low ranking is because of the restraints. Unfortunately, the comfort cows that this ride has just proved to be incredibly uncomfortable and just overall detracted from the ride's layout, which actually does provide some decent hang time and a lot of fun. Bolliger and Mad Ballard, more commonly referred to as just B&M, is very highly regarded for making high quality steel coasters. Known for having a wide range of models and pretty consistent ride quality, B&M is usually considered one of the best manufacturers in the industry. I've already ridden 30 of B&M's roller coasters as of this point, which constitutes a quarter of all coasters they've made so far, so I have a big range of rides to pick for this list. For my best, I'm picking one of the best roller coasters of all time, Fury 325 at Carowinds. This opened as B&M's second Giga coaster, and immediately opened to incredibly high praise. The mix of high-speed bank turns and great flow to airtime puts Fury 325 as my best from B&M. For my worst, I'm going with one of B&M's earliest stand-up coasters, Apocalypse at Six Flags America. This coaster has since been turned into a floorless coaster by the name of Firebird, but I've still only ridden it with stand-up trains. These early stand-up coasters from B&M are known for being quite uncomfortable, and Apocalypse was no exception to this, with its pretty weak layout causing it to be an overall unenjoyable ride. Intamin Amusement Rides is probably one of the most diverse and possibly the best roller coaster manufacturer currently in the industry. Some of Intamin's creations, such as Intimidator 305, Maverick, and Skyrush, are some of the greatest coasters in the world, but I'm going with El Toro at Six Flags Great Adventure as Intamin's best roller coaster. This is one of Intamin's prefabricated wooden coasters, so it causes it to be smoother than most other wooden coasters and performs elements normally unseen on most other wooden coasters. Along with this, El Toro delivers insanely forceful ejector airtime throughout the ride, which ends with a series of intense low-to-the-ground bank turns before rising to the final brake run. While it would be easy to pick one of Intamin's family roller coasters, such as Skull Mountain or Dragon at La Ronde, I think it would be somewhat unfair to compare one of these to Intamin's best. So I'm going with Superman Ride of Steel at Six Flags America as my pick for the worst roller coaster from Intamin. This is one of Intamin's mega coasters, which is a model well known for delivering airtime and intense forces. While some of the airtime hills on Superman do give fun ejector, the oversized T-Rexes and odd straight segments do detract from the ride as a whole. And that concludes the second half of my list of the best and worst roller coaster from each manufacturer. More videos will be coming soon, so be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.